Isabella Moore learned to measure hope in small, careful portions. She grew up in a narrow red brick row house on the outskirts of Cambridge, England, where her father, Martin, ran late-night shifts as a hospital porter and her mother, Evelyn, stitched hems for professors' robes to stretch the bills. Their dinner table talk was practical: rent, schedules, the quiet heroics of doing one thing well every day, and yet Isabella dreamed in constellations of possibility: a career in public health, a passport stamped with places she'd only traced on library maps, a home where kindness was not rationed. She loved early runs along the river, the calm logic of statistics, and Sunday breakfasts with her younger brother, Daniel, who teased her for color-coding everything. A teenage heartbreak, one boy who treated silence like punishment, left a mark deep enough for a private vow: she would never plead to be loved. If love did not arrive with respect, it would not be admitted at all. That promise became the quiet steel in her spine as she entered St. Albans University on a partial scholarship, working evening shifts in the cafeteria and tutoring first years in epidemiology to keep her balance sheet and her dignity in the black. Across town, Adrian Cole woke to the hush of money, rooms that breathed on command, fragrant linen that never remembered last night's sins, and a calendar arranged to make him look inevitable. His father, Richard, chaired a multinational logistics conglomerate and groomed Adrian for the boardroom with the same patience he used for vintage cars. His mother, Victoria, regarded society like a chessboard and her son like a queen she could move anywhere. Their eldest, Clara, curated perfection on social feeds that turned weekends in Monaco into ordinary posts. Adrian's childhood was an itinerary of private schools, alpine winters, and summers on the Solent learning to outpace wind. He collected expensive diversions: sailing regattas, late-night poker in Mayfair, impromptu trips that blurred into the glossy sameness of privilege. The world kept telling him he could do anything. No one asked what he actually wanted. Under the smooth laugh and careless charm beat a pulse of restlessness he refused to name. St. Albans had been a concession to optics. "Understand the people who'll one day work for you," Richard had said, but the campus offered an unexpected seduction. For a moment, his last name mattered less than his next sentence. They collided because life delights in thin margins. On a wet November morning, Isabella, clutching a stack of neatly bound survey drafts, cut through the university's glass-roofed atrium just as a gust bullied the doors. Adrian, late to deliver a guest talk in an economics seminar, strode in from the opposite side, answering a message and not watching his feet. Paper met rain, rain met polished tile, and both met gravity. Adrian's phone skittered, Isabella's pages fanned like startled birds across the floor. He crouched first, not from gallantry but reflex, and then stilled at the notes: precise handwriting, models annotated with questions sharper than most answers he'd heard. "I'm an idiot," he said, offering the kind of apology that could have been theater. Isabella tipped the pages without a smile, the coolness in her eyes stating terms he couldn't read. Around them, students flowed, the atrium echoing with footsteps and weather. "You're Adrian Cole," she said simply, not impressed, not hostile, just factual, as if identifying a weather pattern. "And you're late," she added, glancing at his schedule card that had slipped free. It should have ended there, but the elevator broke, the seminar moved to a different hall, and the two of them, forced by circumstance into the same detour, walked side by side past bulletin boards and rain-blurred windows. He found himself asking real questions about her project. She found herself answering, despite herself, because curiosity is a door even caution sometimes opens. When they parted, he carried the strange awareness of wanting to earn the steadiness he'd seen in her, and she carried an unease at how quickly chaos had arranged an introduction she hadn't asked for. Outside, the rain eased, but both felt the forecast had changed. Isabella Moore's life was shaped not by abundance but by discipline, grit, and an unyielding sense of purpose. Her father, Martin, though weary from his shifts at the hospital, always reminded her that knowledge was the one currency no one could devalue. Her mother, Evelyn, soft-spoken but unwavering, held the family together with her quiet sacrifices, teaching Isabella that true strength often wore the disguise of patience. Isabella's younger brother, Daniel, was mischievous yet protective, and their bond had always been a pillar of her joy. Together they carried each other through storms of unpaid bills and broken appliances, often laughing at their struggles to stop from crying. Even in her hardest days, Isabella carried a deep well of compassion for others, which fed her dream of pursuing a career in public health, a way to merge her empathy with her intellect. She believed if she could help people rise above the circumstances that dragged her own family down, her sacrifices would be worth it. Her university journey was no small feat. While many of her peers arrived with family trust funds and monthly allowances, Isabella lived on scholarship stipends and whatever she could earn from tutoring younger students in mathematics and science. Late nights found her under the harsh white glow of a desk lamp, scribbling notes while sipping instant coffee, fighting sleep with the sheer force of ambition. During weekends, she worked double shifts at a local cafe, smiling politely at customers who never guessed she would later spend hours in the library analyzing health statistics. Her friends admired her drive but often wondered if she would burn herself out. Still, Isabella never allowed exhaustion to derail her. She clung to a vision of a future where her parents no longer had to overwork, where Daniel could pursue his own dreams unencumbered by money, and where she herself could finally breathe without the weight of financial strain pressing on her shoulders. Amelia Roberts, Isabella's best friend and roommate at St. Albans, played an important role in keeping her grounded. Amelia came from a slightly more comfortable middle-class family, but her loyalty to Isabella was fierce and unwavering. She often pushed Isabella to take breaks, dragging her out to watch plays or walk along the river to remind her that life wasn't only about responsibility. Together, they shared secrets late into the night, and Isabella confided in her about her private vow never to beg for love. Amelia admired Isabella's determination but secretly feared her friend's heart was too guarded. She worried that Isabella's strength, while admirable, might one day blind her to genuine affection. It was Amelia who noticed, before Isabella herself, that Adrian Cole's sudden interest in her wasn't just another idle whim of a spoiled heir. Amelia sensed that something unpredictable had begun, the kind of story that could either lift Isabella into a new life or tear her carefully built world apart piece by piece. Adrian Cole was the embodiment of privilege, wrapped in charm sharp enough to disarm even his critics. From his earliest years, he had been told he was destined for greatness, groomed by his father Richard, a stern and calculating businessman, to someday inherit the empire built on shipping and logistics. His mother, Victoria, colder and sharper than the diamonds she wore, rarely offered affection, believing indulgence bred weakness. Instead, she perfected Adrian's image, tailored suits, poised interviews, and rehearsed smiles at charity galas. To outsiders, he was the golden boy, but behind the polished exterior was a young man bored by predictability and trapped by expectations. The absence of warmth at home had turned him toward fleeting pleasures. Parties, women, cars, and impulsive trips filled the void where meaningful connection should have been. He thrived on recklessness because it allowed him to pretend he was in control of his own destiny, even as it spiraled away from him. His sister, Clara Cole, was the family's crown jewel of reputation, admired by society for her elegance and achievements. Unlike Adrian, she thrived under their parents' strict gaze and carried herself like an extension of their legacy. She never failed to remind Adrian that he was wasting his potential, and her words often cut deeper than she realized. Despite his indifference, her disapproval gnawed at him in private moments. Adrian's closest companion was Ethan Grant, a childhood friend from the same world of opulence but with fewer expectations weighing him down. Ethan's love for indulgence matched Adrian's, and together they drowned their nights in liquor and shallow victories, laughing at consequences they never expected to face. Women rotated in and out of Adrian's life like passing seasons, some dazzled by his wealth, others fooled by his charm, but none managed to see past his facade. He ensured it stayed that way. For Adrian, intimacy was vulnerability, and vulnerability was weakness. At St. Albans University, Adrian wore his Playboy mask like armor. He excelled at being noticed without ever revealing who he truly was. Professors saw potential he never cared to prove, classmates saw charm that concealed his indifference, and women saw a fantasy that kept them distracted from his reality. He was known for extravagant gestures, throwing rooftop parties that lit up the skyline, arriving in class in cars more expensive than entire homes, and skipping exams only to pass them with minimal effort. Yet beneath the bravado was a gnawing emptiness he refused to acknowledge. The sight of Isabella Moore, focused, composed, and untouched by his theatrics, unnerved him in a way he couldn't explain. She was everything he wasn't: steady, disciplined, and uninterested in wealth. The more he observed her from afar, the more he realized she wasn't another conquest to entertain him for a night. She was a puzzle, a mirror that reflected the flaws he tried so hard to disguise. And for the first time, Adrian felt an unfamiliar ache, the desire to be worthy in someone else's eyes. Adrian Cole was not accustomed to hearing no, yet Isabella Moore wielded that word like a shield whenever he approached her. Their first official conversation happened in the university library, a quiet space where Adrian rarely ventured. He appeared, leaning casually against a shelf with that infamous half-smile, offering to buy her coffee in exchange for helping him stay awake through boring economics notes. Isabella, unimpressed, simply closed her book and replied, "If you're bored, then maybe you're in the wrong class." It wasn't hostility, it was honesty, delivered with a calm that disarmed him more than flirtation ever could. For Adrian, rejection had always been a temporary obstacle, but Isabella's indifference carried weight. He found himself watching her, noting how she balanced classes, tutoring sessions, and cafe shifts with relentless determination. For the first time in his life, Adrian didn't want to conquer someone for pride. He wanted to understand her, and perhaps even be understood in return. Isabella's friends, particularly Amelia, were wary of Adrian's sudden interest. Rumors about his reckless lifestyle circulated constantly on campus, stories of nights that ended in hotel rooms, debts paid by his wealthy father, and countless women who had fallen for his charm only to be discarded. Amelia warned Isabella not to get involved, but Isabella maintained her composure, claiming she was too focused on her studies to pay Adrian much attention. Yet she couldn't deny the strange persistence in his approach. Unlike other men, Adrian didn't attempt shallow compliments. Instead, he asked real questions about her research, about her family, even about her dreams. It was unsettling, and Isabella often wondered if it was all an act. Still, there was a glimmer in his eyes, a subtle vulnerability that peeked through when he thought no one was looking, and that contradiction sparked a dangerous curiosity in her. Their worlds continued to collide in unexpected ways. During a student debate competition, Adrian surprised everyone, including Isabella, by taking the stage and delivering a powerful, unscripted speech about economic disparity, a subject he had clearly researched after one of their conversations. Though he stumbled, his passion was raw and real, earning applause from an audience that had only seen him as the campus playboy. Isabella watched, conflicted. She saw not the spoiled heir everyone spoke of, but a young man trying desperately to prove he was more than his reputation. That night, walking home under the dim glow of street lamps, Adrian joined Isabella uninvited. She didn't chase him away, though silence hung between them like fragile glass. When he finally asked, "Why don't you like me?" Isabella replied softly, "I don't dislike you, Adrian. I just don't believe the mask you wear." It was the first crack in his armor, and though she didn't realize it, her words ignited in him a determination far stronger than the fleeting whims that had defined his life until now. Adrian Cole had never been known for patience, and when he decided he wanted Isabella Moore in his life, he pursued her with an intensity that startled even himself. Weeks of gentle persistence, studying with her in the library, walking her home after late cafe shifts, showing up at debate competitions he once would have mocked, slowly softened Isabella's guarded heart. Though she continued to question his sincerity, Adrian's actions began to chip away at her skepticism. What truly unsettled her was the way he listened. Unlike others who saw her as a diligent but ordinary girl, Adrian studied her with the curiosity of someone discovering a new world. When he finally knelt in the courtyard of St. Albans University during a bustling spring festival, holding out a velvet box with a diamond that glittered like the sun, the entire campus froze. Gasps filled the air as Adrian, the notorious playboy, declared to everyone that he wanted only Isabella. The shock was electric. Isabella's heart pounded, torn between disbelief and the yearning she'd buried for years. Against her instincts, she whispered yes, and the courtyard erupted into chaos. The aftermath of the proposal sent ripples far beyond campus walls. The Cole family was horrified, seeing Isabella as nothing more than a distraction and a stain on their carefully curated image. Richard Cole, furious at his son's impulsiveness, demanded Adrian call off the engagement, arguing that Isabella came from a family too modest, too ordinary to ever understand the demands of high society. Victoria Cole's disdain was even sharper. She dismissed Isabella as the charity case, and Clara, Adrian's sister, ridiculed the relationship as a temporary fantasy. Yet Adrian stood firm for the first time in his life, defying his parents in a way no one expected. Meanwhile, the Moore family struggled with their own doubts. Martin and Evelyn were proud of their daughter's achievements, but feared Adrian's reputation would only bring her heartache. Daniel, protective of his sister, openly declared he didn't trust Adrian's promises. Despite the disapproval from both sides, Isabella held to her decision, guided less by fairy tales and more by the fragile hope that Adrian might be different with her. The engagement quickly became a spectacle, plastered across tabloids and whispered about in lecture halls. Some classmates celebrated Isabella's fairy tale win, while others sneered, convinced she was after Adrian's wealth. For Isabella, the whirlwind was suffocating. She had never craved attention, and now her private life had become public theater. Adrian, however, thrived in the spotlight, using every opportunity to show her off, as if daring the world to challenge his choice. Yet beneath his bravado, Isabella saw glimpses of nervousness, the weight of proving to himself that he could be faithful, that he could be better. Their relationship became a battleground of trust and skepticism, love and doubt, but neither backed away. When they stood together at their engagement dinner, Isabella trembling, Adrian defiant, the clash of two worlds was undeniable. It was no longer just a love story, it was a war of families, reputations, and expectations. And though Isabella smiled politely for the cameras, deep inside she wondered if her vow to never beg for love would soon be tested beyond anything she had imagined. The Cole-Moore wedding became the event of the year, an extravagant affair that drew nobles, executives, politicians, and curious onlookers from every corner of London society. The Cole estate was transformed into a palace of white roses, crystal chandeliers, and golden arches, with a string quartet serenading guests as they sipped champagne from glasses that cost more than Isabella's monthly rent. For Isabella, the day was surreal, a dream and a nightmare interwoven. She looked radiant in her satin gown, her modest beauty amplified by elegance rather than extravagance, but beneath her calm smile was a storm of doubt. She caught glimpses of her parents, sitting at the far end of the room, awkward in the sea of aristocrats, their proud yet worried eyes fixed on her. Adrian, however, thrived in the spotlight, beaming at every toast, charming every guest, and behaving as though this wedding were not only proof of love but proof of his defiance against his family's wishes. The contrast between his confidence and her quiet unease marked the first unspoken fissure in their union. Among the glittering crowd, Amelia Roberts stood firmly by Isabella's side, adjusting her veil and whispering encouragement. Amelia had always been skeptical of Adrian, but her loyalty to Isabella outweighed her doubts. She watched keenly as Vanessa Reed, a notorious socialite with a reputation for luring wealthy men, lingered too long near Adrian during the reception, her smile sharp and suggestive. Amelia filed the observation away, knowing Isabella was too distracted to notice. Meanwhile, Clara Cole, dressed in an opulent gown of emerald silk, whispered venom into the ears of influential guests, reminding them that Isabella's family was ordinary folk who had clawed their way into elite society through this marriage. Richard and Victoria Cole wore polite masks for the press but exchanged thin-lipped glances of dissatisfaction, already plotting how to keep Isabella at arm's length. Despite the tension, the night dazzled with speeches, music, and a first dance that seemed to cast Adrian and Isabella in the glow of true romance, leaving onlookers wondering if perhaps love could indeed bridge the divide between privilege and modesty. As the evening wound down, Isabella stepped briefly onto the balcony, the night air cool against her flushed skin. She gazed out at the glowing gardens, where fireflies mingled with lanterns, and wondered if this was truly the beginning of her fairy tale or the first step into a gilded cage. Adrian joined her, slipping an arm around her shoulders with the easy charm of a man who believed he had conquered the world. "You're mine now," he whispered, his tone playful yet possessive. Isabella smiled faintly but did not reply, her mind echoing with her private vow never to cry or beg for love. She glanced back into the ballroom, where Vanessa's predatory eyes lingered on Adrian even from across the room, and Amelia's watchful stare never left her. In that moment, Isabella realized her marriage would not just be about love, it would be a battlefield of loyalty, temptation, and endurance. And though her heart was steady, she could not ignore the faint tremor of fear that whispered, the war had only just begun. The first months of marriage carried with them the weight of adjustment, and for Isabella Moore, the transition from her modest world into Adrian Cole's luxurious empire was overwhelming. Their penthouse overlooked the River Thames, with glass walls that reflected the city lights like stars scattered across the water. It was a world far removed from her small family home, where laughter had been louder than possessions. Adrian decorated Isabella with designer gowns, diamond bracelets, and invitations to society's most exclusive parties, but none of it softened the growing distance between them. She longed for simple evenings filled with conversation, shared meals, and quiet affection, yet Adrian often returned late, reeking of whiskey and cologne, his phone buzzing with messages he refused to explain. At night, Isabella lay awake in their vast bedroom, staring at the ceiling and wondering if love could survive on appearances alone. Her heart, once full of cautious hope, now felt the chill of neglect creeping into its corners. Isabella's efforts to bridge the gap were met with indifference. She cooked meals, invited Adrian to join her for morning walks, and even suggested taking short trips away from the chaos of London society. Adrian always had an excuse: meetings, clients, exhaustion, and when he did agree, his mind was elsewhere, his attention divided between his buzzing phone and his own ego. The loneliness pressed down on Isabella, but she refused to complain to her family, not wanting to burden them with her troubles. Amelia, however, noticed the shift immediately. She visited often, bringing warmth and conversation into Isabella's otherwise silent home, and reminded her that neglect, no matter how gilded, was still neglect. "You deserve more than an empty house and broken promises," Amelia whispered one evening, but Isabella shook her head, unwilling to accept defeat so early in her marriage. Still, in the quiet moments when Adrian's absence was impossible to ignore, she feared Amelia was right. Adrian, for his part, convinced himself that he was still a devoted husband, even as his old habits resurfaced. He attended parties under the guise of networking, surrounded by glamorous women who stroked his ego and reminded him of the freedom he once celebrated. His friends, Ethan Grant in particular, encouraged his recklessness, assuring him that marriage was just another game he could control. Adrian justified his actions by telling himself that Isabella was different, that she would always be there, waiting with her patient eyes and quiet strength. But he underestimated the depth of her resolve and the promise she had once made to herself never to beg for affection. As the nights grew longer and the space between them wider, the foundation of their marriage began to tremble. Neither admitted it aloud, but beneath the facade of wealth and smiles, a silent war was brewing, one that would test Isabella's endurance and Adrian's arrogance in ways neither of them yet imagined. The illusion of a perfect marriage shattered slowly, like glass breaking under invisible pressure. Isabella tried to cling to fragments of hope, but the rumors reached her before Adrian's confessions ever could. Whispered voices at charity luncheons, sidelong glances at cocktail parties, and the sympathetic smiles of acquaintances who knew more than they dared to say all pointed to one truth: Adrian was straying. At first, Isabella dismissed it as malicious gossip, but then came the humiliating evening when she arrived unannounced at a private club to surprise him. Instead of finding her husband alone with colleagues, she saw him in the company of two models, laughter spilling from their lips as he draped an arm casually across one's shoulders. The sight sliced through her composure, yet she forced herself to retreat quietly, unwilling to create a scene. That night, she sat at the window of their penthouse, her tears unshed, her heart whispering that her vow to never beg for love was being tested too soon. Adrian's affair with Vanessa Reed, however, was the boldest and most dangerous of them all. Vanessa was no ordinary mistress. She was ambitious, cunning, and well aware of the power she wielded in London's social circles. With her striking red hair and sharp green eyes, she thrived on attention and reveled in the scandal she stirred. She flaunted her connection with Adrian at exclusive gatherings, whispering barbed remarks within Isabella's earshot, all while painting herself as the woman Adrian truly wanted. Adrian, blinded by vanity and intoxicated by Vanessa's manipulative charm, defended her presence rather than protecting Isabella's dignity. When friends and family hinted at the impropriety, Adrian brushed them off, claiming Isabella was overreacting. This betrayal cut deeper than the act itself. It was the public humiliation that gnawed at Isabella's strength. She began to feel like an outsider in her own marriage, trapped in a gilded cage where love was replaced by mockery. Yet Isabella's quiet endurance only deepened the rift. Her silence was not weakness, it was observation. She watched carefully as Adrian's indulgences grew bolder and more reckless, documenting every careless gesture and every insult he allowed Vanessa to hurl her way. Amelia begged Isabella to leave, to stop subjecting herself to such cruelty, but Isabella was not ready, not yet. Her mind was working, her resolve sharpening like steel beneath the pressure. She knew her time would come, but it would not be in desperation, it would be on her own terms, with her dignity intact. In the meantime, she held her composure in public, offering only polite smiles and graceful restraint while inside, her patience twisted into a quiet, searing anger. For Adrian, the cracks in the picture-perfect marriage were invisible. He believed Isabella's silence was acceptance. What he did not realize was that every betrayal was adding weight to a decision Isabella was inching toward, one that would one day turn his world upside down. Vanessa Reed grew bolder with every stolen evening and every photograph that mysteriously found its way into society pages. She thrived on spectacle, dressing in gowns that mirrored Isabella's style but with sharper cuts, deeper necklines, and a deliberate confidence that dared anyone to compare them. At luncheons and charity events, Vanessa would arrive coincidentally, brushing past Isabella with a smirk that needed no words. Adrian, instead of silencing the rumors, often fanned them, choosing to escort Vanessa openly to parties where Isabella had been deliberately excluded. The whispers grew louder, and Isabella became a tragic headline, the faithful wife overshadowed by the daring mistress. The humiliation was not just personal, it was public, relentless, and intentional. Each time Vanessa placed her hand on Adrian's arm in view of everyone, it was less about affection and more about conquest. To Vanessa, Isabella was a weak rival waiting to break, and Adrian was the prize she paraded like a trophy. Isabella, however, refused to give Vanessa the satisfaction of seeing her collapse. She continued attending the events where her presence was both pitied and mocked, walking into rooms with quiet dignity even when eyes darted toward her in judgment. Amelia, always at her side, was furious at Adrian's betrayal and Vanessa's cruelty, yet Isabella maintained her composure. She knew that dignity was her last shield, and she would not surrender it, not to Adrian, and certainly not to Vanessa. Still, the weight of being constantly compared to a mistress who flaunted her victories began to take its toll. Behind closed doors, Isabella's silence grew heavier, her once vibrant laughter replaced by long nights of wordless thought. Adrian dismissed her distance as coldness, oblivious to the storm brewing within her. His arrogance convinced him that Isabella would endure forever, that no matter how much he neglected her, she would always remain waiting in the shadows. But Vanessa underestimated Isabella's resilience as much as Adrian did. What Vanessa mistook for weakness was in fact patience, an endurance that would one day reshape everything. Isabella's silence wasn't surrender, it was preparation. Though bruised by humiliation, she was not broken. Vanessa may have claimed triumph in the social circles, basking in her moment of victory, but beneath that triumph lay a truth neither she nor Adrian could see. Isabella was gathering strength. For every insult endured, she built resolve. For every betrayal witnessed, she sharpened her determination. The mistress might have thought she had conquered, but the true battle had yet to begin. Isabella, steady and unyielding, would not fight for scraps of affection. Instead, she would wait until the day came when her absence, not her presence, would haunt Adrian more than Vanessa's entire existence ever could. And when that day arrived, the so-called triumph of the mistress would be nothing but ashes. The glow of marriage had long since faded, leaving Isabella wandering through the cavernous halls of the penthouse like a ghost haunting her own life. Days stretched into nights with Adrian's absence. His excuses had grown predictable, meetings that ran late, parties he couldn't avoid, clients who needed entertaining. Isabella had once believed she could endure, that patience and loyalty would eventually compel Adrian to see her worth. But as weeks turned to months, her body began to betray the stress she kept locked within. She woke with pounding headaches, skipped meals because her appetite had withered, and stared blankly at the ceiling until exhaustion forced her into shallow sleep. Loneliness carved a hollow inside her, yet she refused to let tears fall. Crying, to her, felt like begging, and she had vowed never to beg for love. Adrian didn't notice, or perhaps he chose not to. Whenever he did return home, distracted and smelling of perfume that wasn't hers, his words were shallow and mechanical, as though spoken only to pacify a wife he no longer valued. It was Daniel, her younger brother, who noticed the toll her marriage was taking. He visited her one weekend, bringing laughter, warmth, and the simple comfort of sibling honesty. Daniel was still in university himself, but his protective nature made him bolder than most. "Bella, you're fading," he told her bluntly as they walked through the riverside park. "I don't recognize the sister who used to fight me for the last slice of pie or chase me down the street when I teased you. You can't keep living like this." His words struck deep, because Isabella knew he was right. She had poured herself into a marriage that gave nothing back, hoping her endurance would be enough to save it. But as she looked at Daniel's worried eyes, she realized she was teaching him the wrong lesson, that love was pain to be endured instead of joy to be shared. His presence rekindled a flicker of strength within her, a reminder that she was more than the shadow Adrian's neglect had created. Adrian, meanwhile, mistook Isabella's quietness for compliance. He convinced himself that she accepted his absences, that her silence was agreement rather than disappointment. In truth, she was retreating, not in weakness, but in preparation. The more Adrian neglected her, the more she invested her energy into rediscovering herself. She began taking long walks, journaling her thoughts, and reconnecting with passions she had abandoned for the marriage. Amelia encouraged her, often spending nights at her side to remind her that life held more than sorrow. Yet loneliness still pressed in, heavier than ever. Isabella stood at the edge of her own endurance, torn between holding onto a marriage she had hoped would blossom and the growing realization that Adrian's neglect was a choice, not a mistake. Each unanswered call, each missed dinner, each broken promise wove itself into a tapestry of betrayal. And as Isabella traced her fingers along its threads, she began to understand that survival might mean walking away from the man she once thought she could change. The question was no longer if she would break, but when she would decide she had borne enough. The turning point came unexpectedly, at a charity gala Isabella had been persuaded to attend by Amelia. She had resisted at first, unwilling to face another evening of whispers and pointed stares, but Amelia insisted that hiding would only give Vanessa and her allies more power. Dressed in a simple navy gown that highlighted her natural elegance rather than wealth, Isabella walked into the glittering ballroom with her chin lifted, determined not to be seen as a broken wife. The event was crowded with politicians, entrepreneurs, and celebrities, but one man in particular noticed her immediately, Alexander Hayes. He was a self-made entrepreneur, a man who had risen from obscurity to command respect in the financial world. Unlike Adrian's polished arrogance, Alexander exuded quiet strength. He saw Isabella not as Adrian's wife, not as a symbol of scandal, but as a woman standing alone in a world that had tried to diminish her. Their first conversation was brief yet piercing, his words laced with genuine curiosity about her interests and her thoughts on the event. For the first time in years, Isabella felt seen rather than judged. Over the following weeks, Alexander and Isabella's paths crossed often, not by coincidence but because Alexander sought her out with subtle persistence. He invited her to join him at small charity initiatives that focused on community health, an area close to her heart. These outings were nothing like Adrian's grand spectacles. They were intimate, purposeful, and filled with sincerity. Isabella found herself drawn into conversations where her opinions mattered, where her presence wasn't decorative but meaningful. Alexander admired her strength, the quiet resilience she carried even when the world labeled her as the pitiful wife. He never crossed boundaries, never pressed beyond polite friendship, but his respectful attention stood in stark contrast to the neglect she endured at home. With every encounter, Isabella began to glimpse a version of herself she thought had died, a woman capable of smiling without force, of speaking without fear, of feeling valued for who she was rather than what she represented. Adrian, of course, remained oblivious. He dismissed Alexander as just another businessman in their social circles, never noticing the way Isabella's eyes softened when she recalled their conversations. Vanessa, however, sensed the shift, her instincts sharpened by jealousy. She mocked Isabella even more viciously at public events, sneering that no respectable man would ever take her seriously. But Isabella no longer flinched as she once had. Alexander's respect had given her a glimpse of strength she didn't know she still possessed. For the first time, she began to ask herself whether love truly needed to be begged for or endured. Could it not be mutual, respectful, and freeing? The thought terrified her as much as it thrilled her. Though nothing improper passed between them, the mere idea that another world existed, a world where she could breathe, where she could be more than Adrian's neglected wife, was enough to ignite a fire inside her heart. That spark, small yet undeniable, marked the beginning of her awakening. While Isabella quietly rediscovered fragments of herself, Adrian plunged deeper into the whirlwind of excess that defined his reputation. Nights blurred into mornings as he hosted endless parties in penthouse suites, surrounded by women whose names he rarely remembered and friends who encouraged every reckless choice. Ethan Grant, his lifelong companion in indulgence, was always at his side, pouring drinks and fanning Adrian's ego with reminders that life was short and meant to be enjoyed. Adrian told himself that he was networking, that each party was a chance to strengthen business ties, but in truth, it was an escape. The applause of strangers drowned out the silence he left behind at home. Yet the more he ran from responsibility, the more the cracks in his empire widened. Clients began to whisper about his lack of focus, business partners questioned his reliability, and his father, Richard, seethed at the headlines that painted his son as nothing more than a spoiled heir. Still, Adrian ignored the warnings, convinced he was untouchable, invincible, the center of every room he entered. Ethan tried, in rare moments of sobriety, to tell Adrian that he was playing a dangerous game. "You're gambling with more than money now," he cautioned one evening after pulling Adrian away from a poker table where he had lost an obscene sum. "You're gambling with your wife, your family, your future." But Adrian only laughed, brushing off the advice with a careless shrug. "Isabella will always be there," he boasted, sipping whiskey. "She needs me more than I need her." That arrogance blinded him to the truth, that Isabella's silence was not submission but preparation. Meanwhile, his mother, Victoria, held her disdain quietly, but Clara did not. She confronted him during a family dinner, her words sharp as glass. "You're destroying everything for a woman who doesn't love you back and for a wife you don't deserve." Adrian stormed out, but her words followed him like shadows he could not shake. Deep down, a part of him knew she was right, but pride and addiction to pleasure kept him bound to his destructive path. As Adrian spiraled, Vanessa Reed tightened her grip. She understood his weaknesses and exploited them brilliantly, weaving herself deeper into his life with every night spent together. She whispered flattery when he lost, praised his charm when others criticized him, and positioned herself as the one who truly understood him. Adrian mistook her manipulation for affection, unaware that Vanessa cared more for the cold fortune than for the man himself. The more he leaned on her, the further he drifted from Isabella, until he hardly noticed her absence at parties or her silence at home. To Adrian, life was a game where consequences never touched him, but he was wrong. The empire he believed unshakable was beginning to tremble, and the woman he thought would always wait in the shadows was already learning to walk toward the light of a different future. Yet Adrian remained blind, celebrating victories that were little more than illusions, never realizing the fall that awaited him was not far away. The scandal broke on a rainy Tuesday morning, splashed across the front pages of London's tabloids. Grainy photographs of Adrian, half-drunk and arm-in-arm with Vanessa Reed, leaving a hotel at dawn, were plastered under bold headlines: "Cole Air chooses mistress over wife." The images spread like wildfire across social media, turning Isabella into the subject of public pity and mockery. At first, Isabella sat frozen in her kitchen, staring at the newspaper Amelia had dropped on the counter, her heart refusing to believe what her eyes already confirmed. Though she had long suspected Adrian's betrayals, seeing the proof displayed for the world to consume tore something irreparably inside her. The scandal was not just private shame, it was humiliation laid bare for strangers to dissect. Paparazzi crowded the entrance of their penthouse, reporters shouted questions about her marriage, and acquaintances called with hollow words of sympathy. Adrian, however, responded with his usual arrogance, dismissing the photographs as misunderstood moments and promising Isabella that the storm would pass. But Isabella knew better. This storm had been building for years, and now the world had simply been given the proof she had already lived with in silence. The Cole family's reaction only made matters worse. Richard Cole erupted with fury, not because of his son's betrayal of Isabella, but because of the stain it left on their family's reputation and business. "You've disgraced the name I built," he roared, slamming his hand on the mahogany desk in his office. Victoria Cole was no kinder, turning her sharp tongue toward Isabella instead of Adrian. "Perhaps if you had been more captivating, he wouldn't have strayed," she sneered, her words striking like daggers. Clara, though less vicious, still echoed her parents' disdain, calling Isabella weak for staying in a marriage that had been a spectacle from the beginning. The message was clear: Adrian's sins would be forgiven, but Isabella would bear the brunt of the blame. For Isabella, this injustice was unbearable. She realized that to the Coles, she had never been a wife or a daughter-in-law, she had been a tool, an ornament, and now, a scapegoat. Society followed the Cole family's lead. High society luncheons that once tolerated Isabella now excluded her, while Vanessa strutted boldly into the spotlight, flaunting her victory without shame. Gossip columns painted Isabella as the pitiful wife too naive to hold her husband's interest, while Vanessa was praised for her daring audacity. The humiliation threatened to break her spirit, but Isabella stood tall, even as her world collapsed around her. With Amelia and Daniel as her anchors, she faced the public with quiet dignity, refusing to lash out or crumble under the weight of their ridicule. Yet behind her composed exterior, her resolve hardened like steel. For years, she had endured, hoping Adrian might change, clinging to the fragments of love he occasionally tossed her way. But now, watching Vanessa bask in a triumph Adrian had allowed, Isabella understood that love without respect was nothing more than a prison. And though she had not yet spoken the words aloud, her heart whispered with certainty: her endurance was nearing its end, and soon, Adrian would realize that silence could be more devastating than screams. The scandal that once weighed Isabella down eventually became the catalyst for her awakening. In the silence of her penthouse, with the tabloids still fresh on coffee tables and Vanessa's laughter echoing in the gossip columns, Isabella made a quiet but firm decision. She would never beg for Adrian's love again. For years, she had shouldered his neglect with patience, convinced that endurance was strength, but now she realized true strength meant reclaiming her dignity. She began to withdraw from the role she had been forced to play, the docile wife who waited in the shadows, and started exploring avenues that reminded her of her worth. She reached out to contacts she had made at charity events, attending smaller gatherings without Adrian, where she was welcomed not as Adrian Cole's wife, but as Isabella Moore. To her surprise, people admired her insight and compassion, and for the first time in a long while, she felt her own identity shining through. It was as if the veil had lifted, and she could finally breathe without the weight of his name on her shoulders. Alexander Hayes continued to appear in her life like a steady light in the fog. He did not overwhelm her with declarations or promises, but his consistent presence offered comfort. He invited her to collaborate on community health initiatives, small but impactful projects that reignited her long-buried passion for helping others. Isabella found joy in working alongside him, not because of his wealth or reputation, but because he respected her ideas. He valued her opinions, listened intently, and treated her as an equal, something Adrian had never done. Their conversations stretched late into the evening, filled with laughter and genuine curiosity rather than pretense. For Isabella, this wasn't about romance, it was about rediscovering the feeling of being seen, heard, and valued. Every interaction with Alexander was a reminder that life could hold more than pain, and she began to wonder how much of herself she had lost by staying tethered to Adrian's neglect. Meanwhile, Adrian grew careless, blinded by his arrogance and the belief that Isabella would never leave. He flaunted Vanessa at public events, certain that Isabella's silence equaled acceptance. But Isabella was no longer silently suffering, she was silently preparing. She began setting money aside, consulting discreetly with lawyers about her options, and even exploring small investments through contacts Alexander introduced her to. Her transformation was subtle at first: straighter posture, sharper words, an aura of quiet confidence, but those who knew her best, like Amelia and Daniel, recognized the shift. Amelia often whispered, "You look different, Bella. Stronger." And she was. Each day she spent away from Adrian's toxicity, each project she dedicated herself to, she built a life that no longer revolved around begging to be loved. Adrian had mistaken her patience for weakness, but soon he would discover the truth. Isabella's silence was never surrender. It was the calm before a storm that would sweep through his world and leave him unrecognizable in its aftermath. Adrian's arrogance reached its peak the night he decided to host one of the most extravagant parties London had ever seen. The Cole penthouse, already a symbol of wealth and excess, was transformed into a glittering palace of lights, champagne towers, and music that shook the glass walls. Guests arrived in designer gowns and tailored suits, buzzing with anticipation, for Adrian loved to shock and impress. Isabella, though reluctant, was expected to attend. Her presence was meant to complete the illusion of the devoted wife standing proudly beside her husband. She dressed with grace, her gown understated yet radiant, determined to hold herself with dignity despite the mockery she knew awaited her. The evening started like countless others, Adrian basking in attention, Vanessa flaunting her boldness, and Isabella drifting at the edges of conversations. But then, amid the laughter and music, Adrian seized the microphone. With a smirk, and in front of hundreds of witnesses, he belittled his wife. Some women are meant to inspire, some to excite, and some, well, some just bore you to tears. The room erupted in uncomfortable laughter, but Isabella felt the words slice through her like a blade. The insult was more than a careless jab, it was a public declaration of disrespect. Isabella stood frozen as the crowd's eyes darted between her and Vanessa, who smirked triumphantly at the cruel spectacle. Amelia, present at her side, gripped Isabella's hand in outrage, but Isabella did not cry, did not plead, did not so much as flinch. Instead, she steadied herself, her silence louder than any defense she could have mounted. Adrian, drunk on his own arrogance, laughed as though the humiliation was a harmless joke. But beneath Isabella's calm exterior, a decision crystallized. She had endured whispers, betrayal, and endless nights of loneliness, but this was different. This was the moment Adrian turned her marriage into theater, her dignity into a punchline. That night, the vow she had once whispered to herself, never to cry or beg for love, solidified into iron. When the party finally ended, Isabella retreated quietly to her room, leaving Adrian to revel in his triumph with Vanessa and his entourage. She sat at her dressing table, staring at her reflection. Her face was calm, but her eyes burned with a determination she had never felt before. She thought of her parents, who had raised her with strength and dignity, of Daniel, who believed in her, and of Amelia, who had stood beside her through every humiliation. She thought of Alexander Hayes, who had shown her a glimpse of respect and possibility. And she realized with startling clarity, the life she wanted did not exist within these walls. She would no longer wait for Adrian to change, no longer sacrifice herself to preserve the illusion of love. Quietly, methodically, she began to plan her exit. The final straw had been drawn, and the decision was made. Adrian had turned their marriage into a spectacle, but soon, Isabella would reclaim her story, and her freedom. The morning after the party, the penthouse still reeked of spilled champagne and stale laughter. Adrian lay sprawled across the velvet sofa, half asleep with an empty glass in hand, while Vanessa's perfume lingered in the air like poison. Isabella walked past him without a word, her steps soft but steady, carrying the weight of her final decision. She had already prepared in silence, her suitcase hidden in the closet, her legal documents tucked neatly into her handbag, her savings discreetly transferred into a private account. Amelia had helped her arrange temporary accommodations and connected her with a discreet lawyer who promised confidentiality. Isabella moved like a woman awakened, no longer chained to fear or humiliation. As she zipped her bag, she glanced one last time at the life she was leaving behind, the marble floors, the endless luxury, and the man who had mocked her love in front of the world. None of it mattered anymore. She slipped her wedding ring onto the table beside Adrian's empty glass, a quiet declaration that she would not beg, not weep, not look back. When Adrian finally stirred awake and realized the silence, it was already too late. Isabella was gone, her absence as deafening as thunder. At first, he scoffed, convinced she was bluffing, certain she would crawl back like every woman before her. But as hours stretched into days, the truth began to sink in. She had not left in anger but with a dignity that unsettled him more than rage ever could. Vanessa mocked the situation, laughing that Isabella had finally admitted defeat, but even she noticed the unease in Adrian's eyes. For the first time, he felt the void that Isabella's presence had quietly filled. He realized how her calm steadiness had grounded his chaos, how her silence had been a wall against the consequences of his excess. But now, stripped of her presence, Adrian felt the emptiness of his empire in ways he never expected. Meanwhile, Isabella stepped into her new life with both fear and liberation entwined. The air outside the cold penthouse felt fresher, sharper, as though the world itself acknowledged her choice. Amelia and Daniel welcomed her into their circle of support, helping her settle into a modest flat in Kensington. It was not lavish, but it was hers, a place where every corner belonged to her alone. Isabella wept for the first time in years, not out of despair but out of relief. She no longer had to perform the role of the dutiful wife to a man who never deserved her love. She walked through the small living room, touching the walls as if they were sacred, and whispered to herself, "This is freedom." In her solitude, she found strength, and in her heart, she knew she had finally lived up to the vow she made long ago, never to cry or beg for love. She had walked away, not in weakness, but in triumph. What lay ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, uncertainty felt like hope. Isabella's new beginning was not paved with luxury but with quiet triumphs that gave her strength. The modest Kensington flat was worlds away from the penthouse she had once inhabited, yet it pulsed with freedom. Each morning she awoke to sunlight streaming through simple curtains instead of automated blinds, and every detail, her worn coffee mug, the second-hand books on her shelf, the flowers Amelia brought each week, felt like an emblem of self-possession. She began volunteering more actively at charity organizations, channeling her pain into purpose. Her sharp mind and genuine compassion quickly caught the attention of directors who encouraged her to take on leadership roles. What had once been whispered about her as the pitiful wife transformed into admiration for her resilience. Though whispers of her past followed her into some rooms, Isabella no longer bowed beneath them. She walked with her head high, a woman no longer defined by Adrian's neglect but by her own determination. Her bond with Alexander Hayes deepened, not in scandal but in trust. He admired how she carried herself through storms without bitterness, and he offered her opportunities to grow, not as a benefactor pitying her, but as a colleague who valued her intelligence. Through his mentorship, Isabella learned to invest, to manage, and to build. She put her savings into small businesses that supported community health initiatives, and slowly her finances grew. For the first time in her life, she wasn't living from a place of survival but of creation. Her evenings, once filled with silence and despair, now thrummed with discussions of ideas, planning sessions, and laughter shared with Alexander, Amelia, and Daniel. She was building a world where she belonged, a life she chose, not one imposed on her. Adrian, meanwhile, began to feel the sting of her absence more acutely with each passing week. He had expected Isabella to crumble without his wealth, to return begging once she realized the comfort she had abandoned. Instead, he read reports in the papers of her new ventures and saw photographs of her at charity events, radiant and respected. His friends mocked him behind his back, whispering that Isabella had risen higher without him than she ever had at his side. Vanessa, irritated that her triumph was no longer unquestioned, lashed out at him, demanding commitment he was reluctant to give. Adrian, once the center of every room, began to feel his circle shrinking, his empire wobbling, and his pride eroding. He had lost Isabella not in a dramatic scene but in her quiet, graceful departure, and that silence now haunted him more than any accusation could have. While Isabella rebuilt her life brick by brick, Adrian's foundation began to crumble, leaving him adrift in the very excess he once celebrated. Adrian Cole's descent was slow at first, masked by bravado and denial, but soon the cracks in his empire widened beyond repair. Business meetings he once dominated with charm now ended in awkward silences as partners questioned his reliability. Several deals collapsed under the weight of his reckless spending and lack of focus, and investors who had once trusted the Cole name began pulling away. Newspapers, once eager to showcase his playboy antics, now chronicled his failures with brutal headlines: Cole air slips, reckless behavior costs millions. Adrian tried to drown the whispers in more parties, more champagne, and more empty indulgences, but the crowds that once adored him began to thin. Even Ethan, his closest friend, grew weary of cleaning up after him, eventually distancing himself with a weary shake of the head. Adrian told himself he still had Vanessa, but deep down he knew even she was staying only so long as the money flowed. Without Isabella's quiet steadiness to ground him, Adrian's world felt hollow, an empire built on illusions that was now crumbling at his feet. Vanessa Reed's loyalty proved as shallow as the relationship she thrived on. At first, she clung to Adrian with the confidence of a victor, showing off their relationship like a trophy. But as the invitations dwindled and Adrian's reputation tarnished, she grew restless. The luxury gifts slowed, the parties became smaller, and the whispers about Adrian's incompetence grew louder. When a particularly devastating scandal broke, revealing that Adrian had lost millions in a failed gamble on a shipping venture, Vanessa's patience evaporated. One evening, she packed her things, leaving behind nothing but a mocking note that read, "I prefer winners." Adrian found himself truly alone for the first time, surrounded not by adoration but by silence. The same friends who once cheered his excesses now avoided his calls, unwilling to be tainted by his downfall. His arrogance had built him a throne of glass, and now it shattered beneath him, leaving only shards of regret. Meanwhile, Isabella's name began circulating in different circles entirely. Articles once pitying her now praised her as a figure of resilience, highlighting her growing influence in community initiatives and her poised appearances alongside respected leaders. Adrian, nursing his pride with whiskey in his father's study, read the clippings with a mix of rage and longing. He realized too late that Isabella's silence had not been weakness but power, the kind of power that could transform humiliation into triumph. The more Adrian fell, the higher Isabella seemed to rise, her dignity contrasting cruelly against his decline. Richard Cole, furious at his son's incompetence, publicly distanced himself from Adrian, calling him unfit for leadership. Victoria offered no comfort, her disappointment colder than ice. Adrian was left with nothing but memories of a wife who had once stood at his side, waiting, enduring, believing. Now she was gone, and with her departure, the last fragile tether to stability in his life had snapped. For the first time, Adrian Cole felt the crushing weight of consequences, a burden he had spent his entire life believing he was above. Adrian's downward spiral reached its most humiliating point when he stumbled into a business summit uninvited, desperate to prove that he still held relevance. His father, Richard Cole, was set to finalize a major deal with several multinational firms, a contract that could stabilize the Cole empire after months of turmoil. Adrian swaggered into the gleaming conference hall, attempting to reclaim the effortless charm that had once commanded rooms. But instead of applause, he was met with cold stares and hushed whispers. Seated at the head of the negotiation table, alongside seasoned executives, was Isabella Moore. She was no longer the timid wife who had endured humiliation in silence. She was poised, radiant, and introduced as one of the key investors backing the venture. Adrian froze, his jaw tightening as he realized the shocking truth. Isabella, through her quiet networking and Alexander Hayes's mentorship, now held controlling stakes in several firms that the Coles desperately needed to survive. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and for the first time in his life, Adrian was not the conqueror but the conquered. The boardroom erupted in polite murmurs as Richard Cole's expression hardened with fury, not at Isabella, but at his son. He had underestimated her entirely, dismissing her as a liability when she had been building her own empire under their noses. Isabella met Adrian's gaze calmly, her eyes devoid of bitterness, only resolve. "Business is about trust, Adrian," she said evenly, her voice carrying across the room. "And trust cannot exist where respect is absent." Her words were a dagger to his pride, a reminder that the woman he had ridiculed now held the fate of his family's empire in her hands. Vanessa's name was long forgotten, his friends had deserted him, and now even his parents, who once defended his excesses, looked at him as though he were the family's greatest failure. Adrian's arrogance had not only cost him his marriage but had dismantled the very foundation of the world he believed invincible. For Isabella, the revelation was not about revenge, it was about freedom and reclaiming her worth. She had risen not through scandal or cruelty but through dignity, resilience, and strategy. Her investments had flourished, her reputation was untarnished, and her alliances were strong. Amelia sat proudly in the gallery, Daniel beamed with quiet joy, and Alexander Hayes stood nearby, his eyes reflecting admiration and pride. The twist was almost poetic. The neglected wife, once mocked as pitiful, had become the woman whose signature now determined the survival of Adrian's empire. Adrian sat slumped in his chair, stripped of his arrogance, haunted by the realization that he had destroyed the one person who had once believed in him. And though Isabella showed no malice, her triumph was undeniable. In that moment, Adrian understood the cruel irony of his downfall. He had spent years mocking Isabella for being too ordinary, only to discover she was extraordinary in ways he could never hope to match. The world seemed to turn its gaze toward Isabella, but unlike Adrian, she did not bask in the spotlight for attention, she embraced it as a platform for change. Her newfound influence allowed her to expand her charity initiatives into fully established organizations, addressing public health issues that had once been her quiet dream. She purchased properties not for status, but for purpose, transforming them into community centers, clinics, and spaces for education. Reporters who once mocked her as the pitiful wife now hailed her as a symbol of resilience and strength, dubbing her the woman who rebuilt herself from ashes. Isabella no longer lived in the shadow of Adrian's name, she had her own, and it carried weight. Her flat in Kensington became the headquarters of her transformation, still modest compared to her means, but full of life, love, and laughter from friends and family who had stood by her. For the first time, Isabella looked in the mirror and saw not a woman enduring but a woman thriving. Adrian, meanwhile, found himself living in the ruins of his arrogance. The empire that once carried his family's name had shrunk without Isabella's support, leaving Richard Cole scrambling to salvage fragments of what remained. Vanessa Reed was long gone, chasing newer conquests, and Ethan Grant, weary of Adrian's recklessness, had severed ties completely. Adrian's nights were no longer filled with champagne and adoration but with the bitter silence of isolation. The tabloids that once celebrated his parties now chronicled his decline, painting him as a cautionary tale of wasted privilege. He often wandered past photographs of Isabella in magazines, her poised smile a reminder of what he had lost, not just a wife, but the anchor he never realized he needed. For all his wealth, for all his arrogance, Adrian Cole was left with nothing but regret, a hollow echo of the man he had pretended to be. For Isabella, however, love did not remain absent forever. Alexander Hayes, who had patiently stood beside her without demanding more than she could give, eventually became more than a confidant. What began as professional respect grew into quiet companionship, and soon into something deeper. Their bond was built not on spectacle or power but on trust, mutual admiration, and shared vision. When Isabella finally allowed herself to embrace this new love, it was not with desperation but with certainty, an affirmation that she could be loved without begging, cherished without compromise. At their first public appearance together, Amelia whispered through happy tears, "This is the love you always deserved." Isabella smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in years. She had walked away from humiliation, endured betrayal, and rebuilt herself into something stronger than she ever imagined. Adrian watched from the shadows of his downfall, but she no longer cared. Her vow had been fulfilled, she had never cried, never begged, and in the end, she had found not only freedom but a new beginning, a life where she was valued, respected, and truly, deeply loved. The end.